I'll introduce our speaker in a minute, but I just wanted to clarify that the chat is open and you can type comments or questions in the chat while the talk is going on if you like, or you can keep them until the end. And then when the talk is over, we'll open up the floor to questions. And so I'll keep track of if anyone had a question that they've asked in the chat as the talk is going on, and just call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question. If you would prefer not to unmute yourself or can't unmute yourself for some reason, then you can just put your question in the chat and I'll ask it for you. So for now, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Eli Rubin, who is a PhD researcher in the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at UCL. And his research focuses on the intellectual and social history of Habad Hasidism, with a particular focus on the significance of the Kabbalistic concept of tzimtzum. He's also an editor and a research writer at Chabad.org. And together with the sociologist Philip Wexler, he's co-author of a new book that came out in 2019 called Social Vision, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Transformative Paradigm for the World. So I am delighted to hand over to Eli.
Thank you so much, Lily, and to all your colleagues in the Hasidic Yiddish research group at UCL. It's especially an honor for me to present in a series that is paying tribute to my teacher, Professor Ada Rapport Albert, and I'm going to actually begin by engaging her work, and in a sense I would say that the first part of my presentation will be a footnote to much of the work that she did over the years. But before going into the details of that, I wanted to just reflect for a moment about what I learned from her and what I saw in her as a scholar and as a human being. She was extremely judicious, extremely discerning, clear-minded and critical, but she was never judgmental. And I think that was really what set her apart, was her ability to combine a critical stance with empathy for her subject. And that's what really sharpened her critical work with a deep humanity and a deep integrity. And I think that, in a sense, one of the topics that I'm going to look at is, or one of the figures I'm going to look at now is Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the 6th Rebbe of Chabad Lubavitch. And in a sense, Ada took a very critical look at his historiographical literary work, much of which was done in Yiddish. But on the other hand, she was also very deeply in dialogue with him, and she had a really genuine admiration for him as a leader, as a forger of new literary genres, and in the same breath as critiquing his historiography, his historiographical account of early Hasidism, she also really did a lot to show how that was very much a part of the way he forged a new future for Chabad. So let me just go to my slides and see if I can move along. Yeah, okay. So by way of introduction, I'm talking here about Yiddish and the imbrications of gender and ideology. And but what I mean by that is that when it comes to Chabad, in both the realms of gender and of ideology, Yiddish can be seen as a medium for the negotiation of boundaries. And this is a theme that I developed in a different way in an article that I published once on Ingeweb, the Internet Journal of Yiddish, taking a look at Chabad's theorization of Yiddish and its significance in historical and cultural perspective. And so in a way, this presentation can be seen as a continuation of that, although I'm covering very different territory. So on the one hand, I'm going to look at how Yiddish is used to cross boundaries through wider communication, which can reach a wider audience, especially women. The popular press is in Yiddish. So through writing in Yiddish and publishing in Yiddish, you can reach a much wider, more popular audience. and Chabad, especially Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Rayats, very much embraced that mode of dissemination of Chabad ideas. And it also goes together with the development of more informal literary spaces in which it may be easier to cross boundaries or to craft a new vision of the past and future. So through writing a story, as opposed to a, let's say, halachic text, formulating a halachic argument, or in a more formal Torah, a more formal Hasidic teaching, through writing a story, you can maybe go into territory, explore ideas that you wouldn't be able to, you wouldn't be comfortable, it would be frowned upon. You can be a little more daring when you're telling a story or telling something, maybe a historical story or a pseudo-historical story, than you can in the more formal genres. And then the other side of that is erecting boundaries. Yiddish is also a way to erect boundaries between the holy and the profane, between what is internal to Judaism or Habad Hasidism and what is external. And I'm going to look at these two sides in the two parts of my presentation. In the first part, I'm going to look at Yiddish literature and the changing status of women, which is more about the first dimension here of crossing boundaries, of using Yiddish to create a different kind of genre where there's more freedom for change. And then in the second part, we'll look at how Yiddish is used to erect boundaries. And these two dimensions are not in contradiction to one another. They can go together, they can be found in the same text. Okay, so part one. So I want to begin with this photograph of Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the Rayats, together with his son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem M, Schneerson, who later succeeded him as the 7th Rebbe of Chabad. The photograph was taken at the Perkersdorf Sanatorium in Austria in February 1935. Now, in the history of Chabad, this is a very interesting time. It's a kind of in-between time when, by this point, Rayats had left the Soviet Union, where he had first risen to the leadership in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. So in 1920, his father had passed away, just as the Bolsheviks were consolidating power over the former Russian Empire. And during that period, he'd been very much focused on bolstering traditional Jewish life, religious institutions, often in secret, through and raising funds and channeling money to operatives throughout the Soviet Union to keep the flame of Judaism alive. In 1927, he was arrested and then after international pressure was released and left the Soviet Union. And in 1934, he moved to Poland. He spent a while in Riga before that and traveled to the United States for a long visit to the United States and to the land of Israel, to the Holy Land, then Palestine. And then he settled in Poland. And the Polish period, which this photograph is taken really at the beginning of the Polish period, is the period that Ada Rapport-Albert paid the most attention to in several articles. And that's partly because this was the time when we really see a literary flourishing. And in a way, I would say that it began here in Perkersdorf. He spent the entire winter of 1934-1935 at the sanatorium in Perkersdorf, together with his son-in-law, just the two of them. They received visitors from time to time, but it was just the two of them. His wife and daughters were already in Warsaw, I believe, at that time. And the doctors had advised him not to talk too much. So he spent a lot of time writing. And one gets the sense that some of the long letters that he wrote during this period were actually addressed to his companion, to his son-in-law, Ramash, even though he's writing to other people. So for example, he wrote a long letter, known actually in Chabad today as the Lange Brief, the long letter, to his daughter, Chaya Mushka, the wife of Ramash. And this letter is a long story, essentially, of concerning a student of the Baal Shem Tov who goes on a quest to find three friends of his youth. to acquaint them with the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And of course, the story is told as history. It's never said. He never says, he never frames it as a literary endeavor. He frames it as a retelling of stories that he heard in his youth. And it's a really striking example of what Ada Rappaport called the blurring of genres that we find in his writings. So I'm not going to focus on that today, but I just want to make one note, which is that although he wrote this letter and addressed it to his daughter, all the characters in this letter are men. Women do appear, but they're always peripheral. So what I want to do here is actually take a look at some texts where we see an evolution where women characters do begin to appear as the years go on in his writings, and frame chart a bit of a trajectory, and beginning with the work that Ada did on this, and then adding a important footnote. Okay, so let's move to two quotes from two important articles of Ada's. The first one will sum up quite a lot of what we've already said. The Admon Yosef Yitzchak was committed to the rehabilitation of the tales in the Chabad school. By blurring the distinction between stories and histories, he was able to inaugurate a new era of hagiographical production in Chabad, drawing on the rich resource of orally transmitted tales, which clearly nourished his own imagination and underlies all his historical writings. One of his earliest informants was his grandmother, the Dowager Rebbetzin Rivka, which reflects his equally novel project of integrating the wives and daughters of the Hasidim in his Chabad constituency. So here, Ada is actually kind of prefiguring what she would do in later articles. She went on to write an article called The Emergence of a Female Constituency in Chabad. And then she wrote a second article on the topic called From Chassid to Tzaddik, in woman from Chassid to Tzaddik. I don't remember exactly. We'll see. I think I have it on the next slide. From women as Chassid to women as Tzaddik. Okay, so just to finish this quote, as a religious leader of ingenuity and vision, he borrowed this potent historiographical idiom in order to validate and harness to action a hagiographical tradition on whose power of edification he was compelled to draw in conditions of unprecedented crisis and change. He may not have uncovered the archaeological truth, but that he created a new historical truth of Chabad is certain. So this is, with that, Ada concludes a very important article, I think a very well-known article, Hagiography with Footnotes, where she establishes a model where there's a distinction between the archaeological history and historical history. So archaeological history is what historians try to, when they try and figure out what actually happened at a certain moment in time, and they try and use contemporaneous sources, or as close to contemporaneous sources as they can, to uncover, to discover the past, to discover an event as it happened, which is a very difficult thing to do because we always have layers and layers of memory, of different perspective, of different impression. It's very hard to even approximate exactly what happened, especially when we have little documentary evidence that goes back. We don't have photographs, we don't have video. We have letters, which the letters may have been written later. They may have been copied. We have memoir literature. We have oral traditions. And obviously there's all kinds of methodological issues that come up when you're dealing with archaeological history, archaeological truth. But part of Ada's point was also that there's another kind of history, which is what becomes important in the fashioning, in the fashioning of history as it progresses. History unfolds, and people use the past to create the future, to chart what the future should look like. And part of what she was saying in this article, Hagiography with Footnotes, was that Rayats, although he was certainly drawing on oral traditions and on different documentary sources available to him. He was also very much concerned with using that past to shape the future of Habad Hasidism. And in fact, in Ada's judgment, he was successful in that. So in a large part, what Chabad is today is the result of Rayats' vision for what Chabad was and his portrayal of what Chabad was. And what I want to look at in part over here is how that vision of the past changes with time through his life. And we see, and in that we can see the reflection of the changing status of women in Chabad during his life. Okay, so now moving on to Ada's article, from woman as chassid to woman as tzaddik. Here, Ada, this is just one brief passage from a long article, and I just want to highlight this passage because she does home in here on a story that Rayats told in 1938 and published in Yiddish in Likutei Diburim. It's in volume 2 of Likutei Diburim, the Yiddish version, on page 1400. And let me just read Ada's analysis here. In one of his talks delivered in Otvok, which is a suburb of Warsaw, in 1938, Joseph Isaac tells a story that celebrates the self-sacrifice and ingenuity of a virtuous wife, who in her afterlife is granted a place in the paradisial palace of righteous women. The reference to this palace clearly echoes the description of the Zohar of 6 or 7 heavenly palaces populated by myriads of righteous women who appear to be free from all their earthly female duties and obligations, occupying themselves instead with nothing other than the ritual, spiritual, and intellectual pursuits that are traditionally the preserve of men: prayer, songs of praise, the performance of all the commandments from which, as women, they had been precluded while living on earth, and even speculation on the mystical rationales for the commandments. Then Ada continues that many of the more radical suggestions that we have in the Zohar about women in the afterlife, women in the heavenly palaces, are absent from, although they're alluded to, because he does allude to the Zohar, many of the more radical features of the Zohar's account are missing from Rayats' tale. So while alluding to the Zoharic account, he chose to ignore its most revolutionary features, focusing instead on the one element that reinforced rather than overturned the conventional gender norms, namely the traditional female virtue of the self-sacrificing, enabling wife who renders her husband a crucial service, which allows him to pursue the male goal of becoming a Torah scholar and to rise to the elevated status of a hidden tzaddik. So at this stage, in 1938, Rayats has introduced female characters into his stories, but they are serving the purpose of not overcoming gender hierarchies, but reinforcing them. So on the one hand, there is some kind of progress, there's a progression. They're not completely absent. Women are subjects, women have voices. So in this story, you know, the woman in the story, the wife speaks up and tells her husband what she thinks, and the husband follows her advice. And as a result, she participates in the reward, or she gets the reward in the world to come. Then Ada in this article continues to juxtapose Rayats with his son-in-law, Ramash, Rabbi Menachem M, Schneerson, who succeeds him as Rebbe in 1950, and we saw before in the picture the two of them together there. And as one of the ways that Ada frames the move from Rayats to Ramash, from the 6th Rebbe to the 7th Rebbe, is that under Rayats, the women are wives and daughters of the Hasidim, but under Ramash, they become the women and girls of Chabad. So they acquire their own autonomous identity as Chabad Hasidim. And we see in 1952, the launch of Chabad Women's Organization at his instigation, and so on. So now, but what I want to do is, I want to take a look at a slightly later story. Right? So this is 1938. And what I want to look at here is Sefer HaZichronos, which Ada did write about Sefer HaZichronos in general terms. Sefer Zechronos, it's Lubavitcher Rebbe Zechronos in Yiddish. It's the memoirs of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of the 6th Rebbe. But these are not memoirs in the ordinary sense, because as Ada puts it, they go way beyond the scope of his own life. And they go right back. In fact, they deal mostly with the prehistory of Hasidism, right? So it's a memoir of the movement rather than a personal memoir. And it's a long cycle of stories centered around mainly centered around the father of the founding Rebbe of Chabad, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founding Rebbe of Chabad, whose father Baruch is the main protagonist of the Zechronos. However, in the 2nd volume, we have a long cycle of stories which center on his mother and his sister. So we have Baruch, the father of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and we have Baruch's mother, Rachel, the Rebbetzin Rachel, and her daughter, Devorah Leah. And in the 2nd volume of the Zechronos, they are central figures. I had never, as far as I know, never wrote about this specifically. And I think it's really fascinating because what's happening here is these were written when he came to America. So Rayats, as we discussed before, he left Russia in 1927. He moved to Poland about 1934. And then with the outbreak of the Second World War and the invasion of Poland, he was extracted from Warsaw, and by the summer of 1940, the spring of 1940, he was in New York. And he set to work immediately rebuilding Chabad again from the ground up, as he had done in Poland, building new institutions, and also set out on a very ambitious publishing agenda. He set up the Kahas publishing house. But this was part of a project really to disseminate and build up a wider consciousness of what Chabad was, what Chabad stood for. And these memoirs were published, they were serialized in the newspapers, in the Morgan Journal. And he actually wrote them initially himself in Hebrew, or Loshn Hakoydesh, but they were published in Yiddish and reworked or translated and reworked by an editor, David Leib Mekler. As you see here, I'm not going to read all the material here, but it's from I put on the slide material from the introduction to the published volume, which was first published in 1965. So what was put in the newspaper, what was published in the newspaper, serialized in the newspapers, was then collected into 2 volumes in 1965. I think actually the first volume came out slightly earlier, with also some supplemental material, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to read through some key pieces from this cycle of stories about Rachel, the mother of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, and her daughter, as they appear in the Yiddish. Okay, so the title of this chapter Pei 80, Alomde Shefroi on ihr Tochter, a learned woman and her daughter. Wenn Baruch der Vater von einem kräftigen Gründer von Chabadischer Hasidus, when Baruch, the father of the emerging, the soon-to-be founder of Habad Hasidism, Reb Shneur Zalman, the Baal HaTanya, hat sich angeheben bekannte mit der Derech Hasidus. When he first became aware of the Hasidic path, the new Hasidic path, hat noch kein gewusst, als Egneltig ist Chassidus verwurzelt und in friedige Deres und ist der Peuer jetzt von einem langen Prozess von Entwicklungen. So he didn't yet know that Hasidus was really, had developed, was the result of what had developed historically over many years previously. Gar wenig hat gewusst, als seine eigene Mishpacha hat vor einem Meshach von Deures gehabt, zugegräht, den Boden von Hasidus, wie auch die Lehre ist später an Pleck geworden durch Rabbi Attentive. He hardly knew that his own family, over the course of several generations, had prepared the way, had prepared the basis of Hasidism as it would later be taught and be revealed by Rabbi Yisrael Bar Shem Tov. Baruch is weg von der Heim, wenn is gewesen noch gar a junge Engel. He left home when he was very young. Hat viel nicht gehabt, kein Schatz zu bekennen mit seiner Schwester Dever Leah, and he didn't even have enough time to get to know his sister Dever Leah that well. Welche hat grad ja gewusst wegen die alle Sachen. She actually did know about all of this. Und wollte für ihn gewesen a Qual von Ideas, and for him she would have been a fountain of knowledge. Right. So at the very outset, Dever Leah is introduced as this figure who was actually much more connected to the history of her own family as it was connected to the history of Hasidism than Baruch was aware. And one of the interesting dynamics in this story is that Baruch is kind of the misnagid in the story. He's the opponent. He's cold. He's a loner. He doesn't want to have to do with society, and he kind of eventually comes round after wandering around and seeking out different paths to God. He eventually comes round to Hasidism and recognizes it's the new path of serving God. But in having left home in order to wander on his own, he actually missed out on the opportunity to get to know his sister Dever Leah, who, as we see as the story continues, had received this knowledge from her mother. So I think that I will not read everything because even though I tried to cut out a lot of stuff and select the more relevant passages, I'm going to run out of time if I keep reading everything. But let's just skip to the opposite side. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm going to use my cursor to point where I am. Ir Mutter Rachel, her mother Rachel, is God given a Lamdonis, was a learned woman. Aber ich sie, Rachel, hat mit ihr nicht gelernt. So here we start to get into the story of Dever Leah. We leave Baruch, we get into the story of Dever Leah, how she wanted to study, she wanted to learn. She would go and listen to the Malamed, Reb Noach, teaching Aleph Beis to the boys, and she would listen in, and that's how she learned to read. And she basically taught herself, she's an autodidact. She understood that her father did not want girls to study Torah. So let's just go back a little bit. If Father of Shnei Zalman, her father of Shnei Zalman, so this is Dever Leah's father, Shnei Zalman, who's also the father of Baruch, who's the father of Shnei Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad, right? So Hakehet Sudi was haben gehalten, he belonged to those who held as Mädelach darf man nicht lernen kein Torah, that girls should not learn Torah. Von seiner Seite wollte Dever Leah viel nicht gedarf kennen kein Ivra. On his part, from his perspective, Dever Leah should not even know how to read Hebrew. Dever Leah hat von dem gehat größer. Dever Leah was very pained by this. So she teaches herself, and then she comes to know that her mother is actually a very learned woman. And here we have a description of her mother learning Talmud. Let's go to the next slide and we'll just read that passage. Jedes Mal, when Reb Shnei Zalman is nicht gewesen in der Heim, any time that Reb Shnei Zalman was not home, Fleg Rachel nemen a sefer and learn mit great kavana. Rachel would take a book, a holy book, and study with great intent or focus. Von Anfang hat Dever Leah gar nicht gewusst, was für a sefer das ist. To begin with, Dever Leah did not know what book this was. Später hat sie herausgefunden, als das ist gewesen a Gemara. Later on, she found out that this was a Talmud, a Gemara. Rachel fleg lernen Gemara mit denselben Niggern und mit derselben Hasmada wie Manspielen. Rachel would study Talmud with the same tune and with the same dedication or diligence as the menfolk. Okay, so then we have Dever Leah confronting her mother. Why do you hide this from me? Why aren't you concerned that I should also become a scholar? And her mother begins to explain to her that there are different, there are two approaches to this. She comes from a family where the women were encouraged to learn. Her father brought her up and educated her. And this is connected with the fact that they come from a line of people who go back to the Maharal of Prague and who are connected with the Kabbalistic tradition, who are connected with the various Balei Shem who preceded the Baal Shem Tov. And so this is connected with what we see happening here is that Rayats, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, is connecting the idea of women studying Torah at an advanced level with the prehistory, with the hidden secret prehistory of Hasidism. Whereas Rachel says, my husband, your father, Schneerson, comes from a family where this was frowned upon, where this was not seen as being the correct path for women to study Torah. So now let's move to, this actually begins another cycle of stories. So we leave Rachel and we go, Rachel's begins to tell Devorah Leah about her family. And we have a bunch of other stories about her family. And then eventually we come back to Rachel, to Rachel's youth and to Rachel's early years of marriage. And this is connected to in the story, they come from poison, and then move to Vitebsk, to the Vitebsk region, where we know that Rabbi Schneerson of the idea was born near Vitebsk, and that's where Chabad eventually emerged and thrived for about 200 years. Okay, so, 150 years or so. Okay, so let's go to chapter Sadik Gimel, chapter 93. And here we have the story of Rachel and how her husband finds out that she is a scholar. So Rachel hat angeheben lernen Torah mamish von dem Tag, was sie hat angeheben reden. Rachel began studying Torah from the very day that she was able to begin speaking. In Anfang hat man ihr gelernt Meidani, die nötige Brachos and andere Sachen, was eine jüdische Tochter darf wissen. In the beginning, she was taught Meidani, the first prayer that you make when you wake up in the morning, and the relevant blessings and other things that a Jewish girl has to know. Später hat ihr Vater mit ihr angeheben lernen Yiddische Limudim Bahadraga, Ivri Chumash Nach, dann Mishnah Gemara. Then later her father began to teach her other Jewish studies, how to read Hebrew, Chumash, the Tanakh, and then Mishnah and Talmud. For Gemara is mit ihr a Ribbus und Rambam and Shulchan Aruch. And then from Talmud, he moved on to Maimonides and to the Shulchan Aruch. So she acquires a full Jewish education, just as a man would. Rachel hat besonders sich abgegeben mit dem Shulchan Aruch, as sie hat genau gewusst alle Dinge. She especially devoted herself. She gave a special attention to the Shulchan Aruch so that she knew all the laws very well. Another thing I should point out here is that together with building up the image of these women as scholars, Rayats is also careful to say that they nevertheless were very good balabastas. They knew how to run the household. They knew how to cook. They had it down, and they were very competent in all the things that are usually allocated to the women in the traditional gender hierarchy. But together with that, they also were able to study and as we're going to see here, to even outshine the men in their scholarship. So in this story, he goes on to say that this was all done in secret. Rachel's education was a secret. When she got married, her husband didn't know that she was a scholar. And what happened? How did it come to light? So let's skip to the next slide. Hapasit, as a kurze Zeit, nach Rachel's Chasana, is die ganze Mishpacha gegangen heim from Beis HaMedrash. It happened that a short while after Rachel's wedding, the whole family was going home from the study house, from the shul, the synagogue. In Farois, seine gegangen die Mann Sibylin. Ahead were walking the men. Reb Baruch Batlan. Reb Baruch is Rachel's father. Sein Sohn Binyamin, his son Binyamin. Und der Eden Reb Schneerson, and the son-in-law Schneerson, that is Rachel's new husband. Noch sie haben noch gefolgt die Frauenzimmer, Rachel besecham. Behind them were following the women folk with Rachel amongst them. And die Frauen haben getragen Händchen zu Shabbat, wie das ist gewähnt der Minhag im Posen. The women were wearing gloves, as was in honor of the Shabbat, as was the custom in Posen. And as was the custom, they were not sewn to their coats, right? So this gets into, it's Shabbat, you're not allowed to carry on Shabbat. Are you allowed to wear gloves on Shabbat? Well, you're allowed to wear gloves as long as you don't take them off and carry them. So in Posen, there was an Erev. So in Posen, they would wear gloves. The custom was to wear gloves, and they wouldn't even sew them to their coats. So the custom, if there's no Erev, if there's allowing you to carry, then you have to sew them to your coat in order to, so that there's no concern that you might take them off and carry them in the street. But since there's an Erev, they are wearing gloves which are not sewn to their coats, right? That's the background to the story. Then they're walking, and the gabbai comes, someone comes and tells them that the Erev has broken. They should no longer be carrying. So what should they do? Are they allowed to walk home wearing the gloves, or do they need to abandon their gloves? So none of the men folk know the answer. These are learned men, and Reb Baruch says, let's read inside here. Reb Baruch Batlen hat sich gewundert, halb in Spaß und halb in Ernst zu seiner lomdische Tochter Rachel. So Reb Baruch turns to his daughter, half in jest, half seriously, to his scholarly daughter Rachel, and says, "No, Rachel, du bist doch etwas klar in Shulchan Aruch. You are clear, you are fluent in the Shulchan Aruch and the code of law. Und kennst doch paskin an shaila. You can paskin a halachic question. You can decide a halachic question." And this is loaded terminology. To say to paskin is to establish authoritatively what the law is. And he's saying to his daughter, you can paskin the halachic question. Bidaf min zich neig sein. How should we conduct ourselves here? And then he says, "Mir mansleit seinen zu viel Faton in Gemara und andere Lemudin." We menfolk are too much involved in the study of the Talmud, which is more theoretical. As es kommt zu dein, so adin, wissen wir oftmals nicht. But when it comes to a practical law, we often don't know. So there's a certain critique here of the hyper focus in male scholarly circles on the theory, on Talmudic debate, as opposed to on the practical application of the law, whereas the women folk who are learned tend to focus on the practical application. And therefore, they are more likely, Rachel is more likely to know what the law is. There's no other choice left to us but to ask Rachel. And so, and part of the whole dynamic here is that Rachel is now exposed. She's embarrassed because she hadn't let on previously that she was a scholar, and her husband is right there, who had no clue of her abilities, of her knowledge in Torah scholarship. And so she's put on the spot. She does lay down the law. She does authoritatively paskin the shaila. And then when they go home, the men look it up in the books, and they find that Rachel is correct. And the continuation of the story is her husband, Schneerson, kind of coming to terms with this new discovery that his wife is just as learned as he is. Okay, so we'll leave it at that. And what I want to do, just before I round this first part of the talk up, is play a little clip of the son-in-law of Rayats, Rabbi Menachem M, who actually published these memoirs in a volume, collected them and published them in a volume by the official publishing house of Habad. And in this clip, it's from a pre-Shavuot address to women in 1988. He references this story from the memoirs, from the Zechronos of the previous Rebbe. Okay, so.
Wenn gehe aber zu lernen in Teile und wissen allein mit eigenem Sechel verstehen, was Teile will und was Teile verlangt und auf was Teile gibt Keach, sagt man, als geworden Minag Yisrael Teile, als von dort zu dort, und in jeder Dorf von Jahr zu Jahr, und im Jahr allein, von Zeit zu Zeit, kommt zu bei Frauen und bei Mädchen, Vaterhassen a viele, bis a viele bei gar kleine Mädchen, als bei jedem von sie allein kommt zu, in Wissen, was in Tere steht, bis und verstehen allein echt, was in Tere steht, bis wann es, dass es kann sein, einmal der Fall, als der Mann oder der ältere Bruder darf fragen bei der Frau oder bei der Schwester, was sagt er im Zusammenhang mit der bestimmten Sache, was hat getroffen als eine neue Sache beim Mann oder beim älteren Bruder, und wie der Nisider Reino, wie der Rebbe der Schwert, der Ziltechit in seine Sichreine ist, als gewähnt passieren, wo seine gegangen Rabbonim und der Drosche gesprochen ist, und mit Männern, und beschaß dann noch gekommen unvorsehene Geschehnisse, sie gewähnt in Shabbat, und sie Bottel geworden der Ehruf, der Mädel geworden die Scheide, was soll man tun mit den Sachen, was man gehabt in die Kirche, was man das alles genommen, in der koscheren Neffen, wie bald da der Ehruf ist gewähnt eine koschere früher, und dann noch ist sich herangemischt, zur seitige Sache, und der Ehre wie Touristen geworden, die Strick, der Mädel geworden ist Ehruf, hatten so gedacht, abstellen und fragen die Scheile, was tut man, bis als eine wird Bottel, und man hat in der Kirche verschiedene Sachen, und erzählt der Schwer in seine Sichrenis, was hat das geheißen, Odruk, und mit Farsim sein. Zu wem hatten sich gewendet und hat gewusst, in der Ruf der Scheile, ist als ewig zwischen die, was eine gegangen, damals in der Schabbesdicken Spazier. Die sehr gewähnt frühen, aber was haben gewähnt Tero, ist das gesehen, haben gewusst, dem Entführer von der Scheile.
Okay, so we'll leave it at that. So here we see that the seventh Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem M, Schneerson, invokes this memoir, this story in the Zechronos, in support of his much more advanced opening up or recasting of the role and the status of women in Chabad. And he uses the authority, he appeals to the authority of the Zechronos to back up his position that there is room for things to shift and things should shift. And one of the things that I found interesting about the way he presents this is that so I have 3 points, which I want to just wrap up this segment with. He's casting this new innovation that over the course of time, women become more knowledgeable in Torah. He's casting this as a tradition, right? So usually tradition is invoked, is seen as a conservative, as something that is used to hold things back. We have our tradition and we stick with our tradition. But here, he uses the phrase Minag Yisrael Torah. It's the custom, it's the tradition. The tradition has the authority of Torah, and the tradition is that in each generation, in each year, women add in their Torah knowledge and ability to contribute to Torah discourse, right? So I think that's just a very interesting use of tradition, right, in service of change. Another point is that actually some of the more radical features of Rayats' story are not explicitly mentioned or invoked by Rabbi Menachem Mendel in this talk. For example, I pointed out before the word psak, which is a very loaded word. To say that a woman can paskin is a radical step. To say that she has the authority to decide a matter of Jewish law, and he doesn't use that phrase here, right? So we see, on the one hand, he's invoking the authority of that. Again, how much of that is conscious, how much of that is premeditated, I don't know, but I'm just pointing out the different dimensions of what's happening in this talk. Third point is that actually, in a sense, this talk is itself a performance of the change in women's status that happened over the course of the 20th century in Chabad. The women are sitting in the main synagogue, which is usually occupied by men. And the men who want to listen in to the Rebbe's talk are relegated to the women's gallery. Right? So that's actually an embodied shift of the gender hierarchy, at least on a limited level at that time and in that space. Okay, so part two, I'm going to wrap this up much more quickly, but I just want to give another example of how Yiddish is used as a mediator of change, of difference. Where are the differences? Where do differences lie? So we can overcome differences and we can build up differences using Yiddish. And in this talk, which incidentally was brought to my attention by my wife, so it's a segue from the previous section, even though this has nothing to do with gender. This is from a talk delivered in 1952, and then subsequently published in the sichahs, edited and published in the sichahs. And what struck me as really interesting about this talk is that the Rebbe, it's a Yiddish talk. It was delivered orally in Yiddish and then written up and published in Yiddish. But what he's doing is he's looking at 3 Hebrew words, Loshn Hakoydesh words, which are part of the traditional liturgy of the high holidays, teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah. And he's critiquing the assumption that they should be translated and understood in according to their ordinary English translations. So so he's using Yiddish to talk about the English translation and the problems of the English translation of these Loshn Hakoydesh terms. And without going into all the details and without reading inside, just the main point that we see here is that we'll take up the example of charity. So he says that charity, tzedakah, charity, tzedakah and charity are actually 2 very different concepts ideologically. Charity implies that there is no obligation. There's no obligation to give charity. The money is mine, and if I'm good-hearted, then I will give charity. Whereas the word tzedakah has the connotation of justice. It's from the word tzedek, justice, which means this is what is right, this is what is just, this is what is required from a just and ethical perspective. It's not something that I choose to do out of the goodness of my heart. Rather, the fact that I should give to the poor is something that is just, it's required. Maybe we'll read just that section inside, see how he, okay, so this is Tess. Tzedakah, die genaue Übersetzung von charity of Loshn Hakoydesh is chesed. The precise translation of charity, right? So you see in Yiddish, in Aleph-based letters with Yiddish spelling, he writes out the English word charity, right? And you find this actually, if you listen to his Yiddish talks, you'll find every so often an English word thrown in there, but often Yiddishized. If Loshn Hakoydesh is chesed, so charity in Hebrew and Loshn Hakoydesh would be chesed, kindness. Aber bei Yidden heißt es nicht mit dem Namen chesed, but we don't call charity chesed, nor mit dem Namen tzedakah. We use the word tzedakah. Der Unterschied von chesed bis tzedakah is eicha hofgistika. The distinction between chesed and tzedakah is they are opposites. Chesed unterstreicht as is a guter Mensch. Kindness underscores that the giver is a good person. Das heißt, jenem kommt nicht und ist nicht mechuyev ihm zu geben, meaning that the other person does not deserve to get this gift, and he's not obligated to give it to him. But because he's good, therefore, so it's a virtue. Dagegen tzedakah unterstreicht Gerechtigkeit. Tzedakah, on the other hand, underscores justice or rightness. And das is in zwei Eifanim. This goes in 2 ways. Aleph is mechuyev zu geben jenem, weiß as git nit seiner. He's obligated to give to the other. He knows that he's not giving his own what he himself owns. God gave it to him in trust that he should give it to others, right? So there's a different concept of ownership, a different concept of your relationship with others, which is lost when you simply translate a Loshn Hakoydesh word into English. And when you do that, what you have is a non-Jewish or a non-Chabad or non-Hasidic concept, which is actually borrowed, which comes from a different culture with a different set of ideological values. And I think that this is something which is very important to think about, in terms of contemporary discourse. In the United States, people often invoke, one might suggest for political reasons, the Judeo-Christian alliance or the Judeo-Christian tradition. And part of what's going on over here is that the Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem M Schneerson, is saying, yes, we're in America. And yes, there are other people who have values and even religious values, but they are not the same as our values necessarily. We can't allow ourselves to become ideologically assimilated. We can't uncritically allow ourselves to translate directly from Loshn Hakoydesh into English. We need to think first in Yiddish. And Yiddish is the language in which he negotiates this problem. Okay, so I will leave it at that. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Excellent, Eli. Thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. And I very much appreciated the section where you talked about Ada's work and about Ada's influence, obviously, because I was also a student of Ada. And so on a personal level, I'm really touched by that. And I think it's an excellent addition to have to this seminar series, which is in her name, and it was a really fitting tribute. So I would like to open up for questions. So if we have anybody who would like to unmute themselves, then please just put in the chat that you'd like to ask a question so that I can see you, or raise your hand with the raise hand function. And Eli, maybe at this point we can stop sharing the screen so that we can get more faces on. And then if you need to show anything from the slides, we can bring them back up again. Anna, would you like to ask a question?
No, not really a question, just a very heartfelt thanks for the class. I have just unfortunately switched to Biblical Hebrew with the LJS, but that was an amazing and very insightful hour. So thank you so much, Eli. And I'm looking forward to the next. That's all I had to say. So I will say my goodbyes, but a thoroughly wonderful, insightful class. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Any questions? Would anyone like to? I can see quite a lot of people now. So if anyone wants to physically raise their hand, or Sam.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I just had a question. Could you maybe talk a little bit about the role of elites? So there are certain exceptions or certain affordances that are provided to, let's say elite women within the larger Hasidic culture, and with the stories that you mentioned, the particular story that you mentioned from his Zichronis, what would these types of dispensations or rights be provided or afforded, let's say, to everyday, let's say, Chabadsker women, as opposed to, let's say, a revered figure? And so is this really telling us so much about gender, or let's say qualify it a little bit more about the intersection of gender and elite status? So could you, tell us a little bit about that?
That's a great question. And Ada Rappaport Albert herself wrote actually on this point. One one of the things that she showed was that if we go back to the beginning of the 20th century under Rayats' father, Rashab, Rabbi Shalom Dober, Schneerson, we do find there's one case that I wrote about and brought to Ada's attention several years ago of a woman named Sonia Rosenblum, who as a girl, she was from the Gerari family, a wealthy elite Chabad family. And she, according to family traditions, according to traditions that we have, from people who were around at that time, memoir, she was not only a scholar of Hasidism. It's said that in later life, in the 1940s and 50s, when she'd already moved from Russia to Israel, her husband would have to wait for her on Shabbat afternoon to finish her prayers, right? So, but going back to her youth, she was born into an elite family, and apparently she was instructed together with her brothers. According to some accounts, she had private audiences with Rashab, with the Rebbe at that time, where she was able to ask questions about intellectual issues in Hasidism. And we have a letter that she wrote to Rayats during his father's lifetime, who was not much older than her. And so that itself is interesting that she was writing directly to him. We actually have Rayats' letter to her. And it's a very, deeply psychological letter dealing with the role of a mentor and a student and what it is to be a student, and also giving it a certain gender balance. So Ada's response when I showed her that this letter, which she had previously not seen, was that, and later on she commented on it in one of her articles, was that this is a class issue, as you're saying. She's a member of the Gerari family, a wealthy elite Chabad family. And so, but on the other hand, as Ada herself showed, with the passing of time over the course of the 20th century, that did change. And so from the 1940s onward, when at the time when the Zecharinas were being written and published, we had the Beis Rivka schools being set up, where girls are taught, maybe not yet at the same level as boys, but there is the ethos where it's understood that girls should be exposed to this. In any Chabad girls' school, they will study Hasidic texts. They will have some exposure to Talmud. In seminary, post high school, they will have classes in Talmud. Now, is it at the same level as the boys? No. Is it done in the same way? No. But certainly, it has been opened up to all Hasidic girls. It's no longer an elite thing anymore. And I would say that there's still progress to be made, even if we just go by the Rebbe's own words about the sights that he set, the vision that he had for women's education. The Chabad movement has not gotten there yet. And you could say the same for boys' education as well, actually. And that's cool.
Thanks, Eli. Tali, do you have a question?
I just thank you very much, Eli, for that very interesting paper. I just wanted to comment on this class issue and ask you if you could respond. The one thing is about, in general, girls studying or not studying, but a quite different issue is what you very interestingly described is this lengthy letter from the Rayats, in fact, before he was Rebbe, to this young woman. And Ada saying it's a class issue, it's obvious what she meant. I would have thought she was from the Gerari family, a very major family. But in the 1930s, the late 1930s, from Otvotsk, the Rayats responded to a girl called Chaya Sima Mikhailova, who, as far as I know, was not from a distinguished family. I did try to research her, and she's a girl from Riga, and she wrote a question: what should I do about the emptiness of action? I think she wrote in Hebrew, and the letter responding to her is in Hebrew. So she asked about Reikut Hamaasim, the emptiness of action. And the Rayats, who was the Rebbe, responded with a 3 or 4 page letter, an absolutely remarkable guidance in personal meditation and contemplation. And I was visiting Riga in, I think it was 1994, and Rabbi Barkan, who was a rabbi there, a Chabad rabbi, he told me that there were a number of lengthy letters from Rayats to women. He told me of a letter that he had seen of 18 handwritten pages to a young woman. So the Rayats did seem to go, and which maybe didn't survive into the Igrot Kodesh, which were published. So how would that, how would you use that kind of material?
Yeah, well, I should have mentioned your work on the Achot HaTmimim group in Riga, and I think that's an example of how already then in the 1930s, Rayats was already branching out and taking it beyond a small group of people close to the Rebbe's family or with access, and was certainly legitimizing and encouraging women to study, but also on the other hand, I think that the Achos HaTmimim group in Riga focused on Hasidic texts, not on Talmud, not on halacha, right? So that's a further step, and I think that's interesting. I think the whole dynamic in this in the story in the Zechronos of putting such an emphasis on the study of Talmud in the same sing-song as the men, and having this mastery, right, that she has it at her fingertips. I think that's something quite different from what we see with the Achos HaTmimim group, and frankly, I think it's it's surprising, and I think you see from the talk the 1988 talk of the seventh Rebbe. I think that went a long way, that gave him the authority, the basis upon which to go significantly further and more openly, not just within the framework of a story, but to explicitly set forth a program and to make scholarly arguments that this is okay. Not only is it okay, this is what has to be done, and to confront other Hasidic figures. There's a famous conversation that he has with the Belzer Rebbe, trying to persuade him that he needs to the girls need to study. So. Yeah.
With the Belzer Rebbe, that was Hasidic teachings.
Right.
He was trying to persuade him.
Yeah. No, but there also there's a discussion about Talmud also, because he says the Belzer Rebbe brings up the Talmudic idea about Kol HaMelamides B'Torah Kilo Melamde Tiflos, which seems to be about the argumentative, being able to engage in that kind of debate is a negative thing to teach women, and that doesn't seem to be about that suggests to me that conversation is broader than just about Hasidic teachings, possibly.
More questions? I can't see everybody, so if you don't have your camera on, then just mention in the chat if you have a question. Esther? Yep.
So I was just wondering, you started your talk saying that Yiddish is used to sort of create bridges and also to divide or to separate. And you spoke mostly about the first part. So if you could speak a little bit about the second part, when Yiddish is used to divide or separate. Thanks.
So, the example that I had of Yiddish as a device for separation in Chabad is this discussion of the difference between the English translations of these terms, of these, charity, prayer, right? So these are all, when we say prayer, when we say charity, when we say repentance, there's a certain baggage that those words have, and the baggage is the English or the Western cultural context, which is, so part of this is that language is a vehicle of culture. And one of the things that's lost in translation is the culture that the suggestions of language, the intimations, which are perhaps not always so clearly spelled out, but which are there buried in all the associations that particular words have, and the history of those terms and the way those terms were thought about in that culture. So here, I think Yiddish becomes, and the importance of Yiddish in Chabad today, more, not going beyond this talk, is really about preserving that distinct culture and using it to create a sense of difference, that we are not just Americans in America, and we're not just Jews in America who privately act in certain ways and have certain religious practices. We have our own culture, which is different from the culture of America, and that culture comes together with a different set of values, a different set of ways of thinking about different things. And I think Yiddish is very important to that negotiation, that the creation of a separate space. We see it in other Hasidic groups in a much more obvious way, but I think it's also something that we see in Chabad, perhaps more subtly, right? And so, the shift from talking in English to talking Yiddish can be a marker of, am I talking to the larger audience or am I talking to the Hasidim? So, when another similar example of this, much more subtle, is if you look at the Yiddish talks of the 7th Rebbe. The earlier talks, when he's speaking to a relatively small group of Hasidim who are in the synagogue in Brooklyn, there's a different pace. He's speaking faster. There's a kind of intimacy. They are more heavy. The Yiddish is a stronger Yiddish. There are more Yiddish words in the mix. Later on, when he's talking to a wider audience, even though he's still talking Yiddish, later on in the 80s, his weekday Farbrengens are being broadcast on satellite TV. There's a different tone. He's speaking to not just the Chassidim in the room, right? And so the Yiddish is a different Yiddish. It's a more rabbinic. There's a lot more rabbinic Hebrew. He speaks slower. He will throw in. I think another interesting thing is to think about is the way that he deals, and this talk is an example of that, the way he deals with English terms, because he does use English terms, and sometimes he marks them as being English terms, I'll say the Loshn Hakoydesh, right? And sometimes he doesn't, right? Sometimes they just become part of the Yiddish, right? Because Yiddish itself evolves. So I think these are interesting things to look at, the subtle way in which going in and out of Yiddish, or emphasizing that something is Yiddish and something is not Yiddish, what's going on there? And I think a lot of what's going on there is this marking of a certain boundary, creating a certain space that is inside and versus a space that is outside.
Thank you. If I may reply to that for just 1 second. It's interesting that the example that you used to illustrate this was actually a Hebrew word, not a Yiddish one, tzedakah, right? So I think it's kind of, I see what you're saying, and I could not agree more. I mean, Yiddish is certainly used in this way, but I was just wondering where specifically the Yiddish comes in rather than, sort of
right.
Jewish language as opposed to not Jewish.
Right. Well, so the language in which he's thinking about this and speaking about this distinction is Yiddish, right? So Yiddish is the language in which we think, in which we that's the cultural context in which we can do this work of separating between what the Jewish meaning of tzedakah is versus the non-Jewish, right, meaning of tzedakah is. What's the language in which we're going to explore that distinction? That language is Yiddish. I think that's the interesting thing.
Thank you so much, Eli. So I think probably it's about time to wrap up, unless anyone has any last questions that that you didn't get a chance to ask. Thank you so much, Eli, for a really fascinating and stimulating talk. So if anyone wants to unmute yourselves, you can clap with sound. And I would just like to say that following on from this theme, our next talk is going to be on Tuesday, the 1st of December, and it's going to be given by Dr. Tali Lowenthal, who is here with us today. And it's a good segue from this talk. It's going to be on Yiddish in London Chabad schools. So following on from this topic about Yiddish in Chabad and as a language of education, that's what the next talk will be about. So we'll be sending out the Eventbrite links and the announcements about that a bit closer to the time, probably in a couple of weeks. So we hope to see you there. Thank you to everybody for joining us. It's really nice to see so many of you. The next talk, just mentioned it's going to be, the plan is that it's going to be given in Yiddish. And we're going to have some facility that will cater to people who don't speak Yiddish. So please come to that as well if you're interested in Yiddish and in hearing Yiddish. So you got a bit of exposure to Yiddish in this session, and the next one there will be more Yiddish. So thank you to everyone. It's so nice to see so many of you coming back again, and we hope to see you again at the next talk. And until then, take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Eli.
Thank you. Shkoyach.
Shkoyach.
Thanks, Eli. Thanks, Eli.
Thank you.
And
Thank
Saul,
you.
it's lovely seeing you.
Yeah, really nice to see you, Saul.
Lovely to see you, Lily, and thank you, Ellie. What a lovely talk and what a lovely
Thank you so
tribute
much.
to Ada. I really appreciated it.
Thank you. I'm glad.
And hi, Philip. Good seeing you. Yeah, yeah. And Lily, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Tali.
I finally got in. There's always.
Yeah.
It's like
What was it?
it's like the
Yeah,
upper
sorry,
world. There's always some kind of difficulty getting in.
Zoom Mises. Hi, kids. Nice to see you too.
Hi, Izzy Posen. Take care.
Izzy, actually, you and
Hi.
speak about our plans for your talk, Tali. We've just been discussing subtitling options or like simultaneous interpretation. So you two might have to liaise.
Oh, that's great.
Because,
Okay.
Yeah, so Tali, give me some time. Sorry, Eli. I'm looking into translating options with Zoom. So give me some time to figure that out, and I'll speak with you.
Right. Okay. I mean, okay. So we'll talk together about it. You know. So you got my email? Or Lily?
Either I have it or I'll get it from Lily.
yeah, I can give it to you, Izzy.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
we'll work it out. Yeah.
What's the date of your talk again?
1st of December.
All right.
Yeah. I mean,
Lovely.
you see, unless I pre-record the talk and then you do it with subtitles, the easiest thing will be that I just say the talk and you simultaneously translate. I used to do simultaneous translation of the Rebbe's sichahs.
Really?
Speak in Yiddish, and I would speak, I would have that in earphones, and I would speak in English so that people who didn't understand Yiddish will be able to hear it. And you know who did that as well? Shimon Abramsky.
Did he? Shimon Abramsky?
Not with the earphones, but the Rebbe gave a talk. They hadn't got that organized yet. But he came to one of these 3 o'clock in the morning in London time, talks by the Rebbe, and Shimon came. And when the talk finished and there was singing in between, Shimon translated the talk to all the people around.
Oh, wow.
He became a chayzer.
So that's what we had in mind, isn't it? We were talking about doing like simultaneous interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I get to get it to work on Zoom, that's what we'll do. So I'll be listening to you in my ear and saying and translating in Yiddish verbally live. And then people who come to
but
the
the thing
can
is, how
choose
will
whether they
the
listen to you
people
or to
be
me.
able to hear one rather than the other? That's
They can choose. Zoom gives them an option to choose which channel they want to hear. They can either listen to the Yiddish or to the English.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's an 8. The other way is, I might write the whole talk out, and then some sort of, selected bits of translation could be got and like put in the chat or something. It doesn't have to be subtitles to a picture, but it could be like in the chat, the right segment of the talk, something like that.
Yeah, that's an alternative we were thinking about. We can discuss.
Yeah, okay.
Zoom-Geschäften.
How is Stamford Hill, Tali?
It's still around.
Good
It
to
would
hear.
always be. It would always be. Although it's been expanding, hasn't it? It's now Stamford Hill reaches all the way to Essex.
It's not just how far it reaches; it's the number of Stiebler. That's the last count I made. There were 80 Stiebler, 80 shuls in Stiebler, and it increases all the time. And every so often, you walk down the street, there's a new one. Yeah.
It was your count during COVID, because during COVID, almost every other 10 Jews had a Stiebel.
Oh yeah, there were dozens of garden minyan, garden Stiebler. Yeah. Very true. Zoe, thank you very much for letting me in.
You're welcome. It was lucky that I had the email.
I was just searching in the emails for the link. I just couldn't find it. I found the one for the last meeting, and I went into that, and this meeting was in October, or something.
Well, luckily you weren't alone. There were a couple of other people at the same problem.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hi, Sonia. Long time no see.
Hi.
Yeah. Okay. All the very best to everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone.
Bye,
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Kelly.
And thanks, Ellie. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Bye.
Bye.